There's a silent thief crossing the fence line of every farm in this country right now, and it costs you yield, it hurts your neighbors, and you cannot see it with your eyes. It is called pesticide drift, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency has documented that under the wrong wind conditions, a substantial portion of every spray application can move off target onto land you never intended to treat. Imagine paying full price for a chemical that ends up drifting away on the wind, hitting the wrong field, the wrong crop, or the backyard where someone else's child is playing. But there's a solution that costs you almost nothing, that your grandfather already understood, and that the largest agricultural corporations in the world have quietly stopped talking about for one specific reason that I am going to make crystal clear before this video is over. Before we open this story, if what I'm about to share with you matters at all, the best way to keep this knowledge alive is simple. Subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and share this video with the farmer, the gardener, or the family that lives next to a treated field. Now let me show you exactly what defensive planting is, and why it works better than the most expensive drift-reducing nozzle that any sales rep has ever tried to sell you. Peer-reviewed studies measuring herbicide drift from sprayed fields into adjacent plots have shown that yield losses on the downwind side commonly range from 12 to 34%, depending on the wind conditions on the day of application. That is real money walking off your property, and most farmers never even calculate the loss because the damage shows up across the fence line where someone else has to absorb it. But plots protected by a single strip of tall growing plants planted at the edge of the field have shown drift reductions between 50 and 90% in the published literature. I'm putting together a complete defensive planting guide that lays out exactly which species to plant, the spacing, the density, and the canopy height each plant needs to actually stop drift in your specific zone. Stay with me through this video because the 7 plants on that list are mostly things you already grow, things you can plant from seed you already have at almost no recurring cost. Defensive planting is the practice of using living plants as a physical and biological barrier against pesticide, drift, dust, wind, and even some pest pressure. This is not a new idea. That is the part that should make every grower angry once they hear it. The United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources Conservation Service has published Conservation Practice Standard 380 for windbreak and shelter belt design, and the framework goes back to the 1930s. After the Dust Bowl, federal agronomists and the Civilian Conservation Corps planted over 200 million trees across the Great Plains, specifically to stop drift, erosion, and soil loss. It worked. Wheat yields stabilized, soil stayed put, and rural communities slowly recovered from the worst agricultural disaster in American history. Then in the 1970s, the chemical industry came of age, and the conversation in extension offices quietly shifted away from living barriers and toward chemical drift-reducing additives, low drift nozzles, and engineering solutions you have to buy every year. Before we go any deeper, tell me in the comments what country and what state you're watching from right now. I am genuinely curious how many growers around the world are dealing with drift right now and discovering this knowledge at the same moment. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment to do it, because what I am about to show you in the next 10 minutes will change the way you look at every fence line on your property. Now here is what I'm offering you, and pay close attention, because this is the part that changes everything. I have put together a complete documentation called the Defensive Planting Field Manual, and it includes the 7 specific plants ranked by drift reduction performance. It includes the exact spacing in feet for each species, the planting window by United States hardiness zone, and the cost analysis showing why most farmers pay almost nothing to implement it. It also includes the 3 biggest mistakes that cause buffer failure, the legal protection. A documented buffer gives you against drift complaint lawsuits, and a downloadable design template you can adapt to any field shape. The link to access the complete manual is in the description, pinned in the first comment, and I will mention it again at the very end of this video. Now, let me show you exactly which plants make the list and why one specific species outperforms almost every other plant ever tested in field conditions. The #1 performer in nearly every published buffer study is grain sorghum, the same crop millions of farmers are already growing every season. University extension trials have measured drift reduction in a single row of sorghum or sorghum Sudan grass planted at field edge. At full canopy, around 6 to 8 feet tall, a single dense row can reduce herbicide drift by between 60 and 90% measured downwind, depending on wind speed and droplet size. One row, 6 feet of plant, up to 90% reduction. Quick reminder, the complete plant list with spacing, timing, and design templates is inside the Defensive Planting Field Manual, linked in the description and pinned in the first comment of this video. This is the same kind of documentation that consultants charge between $200 and $400 to put together for a single farm operation. I am giving you the entire structured plan in one place, organized so you can implement it on the next planting day, no consultant needed. The number 2 performer is sunflower, specifically the tall confection types that reach 8 to 12 feet at maturity, with broad leaves that catch droplets like a net. Trials with sunflower buffers have shown that 2 staggered rows can reduce broadleaf herbicide drift by between 60 and 75% at the property line. Sunflowers also bring something the chemical companies cannot sell you, which is a wave of pollinators that increase yield in every nearby crop that depends on insect pollination. Field research has documented yield gains in adjacent pollinator-dependent crops just from the bee traffic generated by a sunflower border. The number 3 performer is switchgrass, native to almost every state east of the Rocky Mountains and one of the most underused buffer plants in modern American agriculture. Switchgrass grows 6 to 8 feet tall, holds canopy from late spring through hard frost, and does not require replanting because it is a long-lived perennial. Plant it once, and it works for 15 to 20 years, with almost zero recurring input cost after establishment. Number 4 is hybrid poplar, used in commercial windbreaks across Iowa and Minnesota, growing 5 to 8 feet per year and reaching usable buffer height in just 2 seasons. Number 5 is native willow, especially along ditches and waterways, where it doubles as a drift buffer and as soil erosion control on the bank. Number 6 is the multi-species hedgerow, combining hawthorn, dogwood, and elderberry. The same system used across the United Kingdom and Northern Europe for centuries before chemical agriculture arrived. Number 7 is something most farmers laugh at when I first mention it, but the data is undeniable, and it is standing dead corn left over from the previous season. Field studies have shown that even a strip of unharvested corn, 12 rows wide, can reduce spring herbicide drift by around 40% into adjacent fields. That is 40% reduction from a plant you already grew, did not have to plant again, and that cost you nothing extra to leave standing through winter. This is exactly the kind of information that does not appear in any glossy seed company brochure, and there is a very specific reason for that. There is no patent on a row of sorghum, no royalty stream on a sunflower seed you saved last year, no trademark on the standing corn from your own field. The global agricultural input industry generates roughly $240 billion in annual revenue, and that number has been climbing for 2 decades. That revenue depends on selling you something every season that solves a problem chemically, mechanically, or genetically. A buffer of plants you already grow, planted once, performing for decades with almost no input cost, breaks that revenue cycle entirely. This is why the agricultural extension agencies in the 1930s and 40s heavily promoted living buffers, and why by the 1990s almost nobody in mainstream extension was teaching this anymore. It is not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. It is just incentive structure, and incentive structure is more powerful than any conspiracy ever invented. Now let me show you the design, because the difference between a buffer that works and a buffer that fails comes down to 3 measurements that most farmers get wrong. First measurement is height. Your buffer must be at least 1.5 times the height of the spray boom, or 1.5 times the canopy height of the field you are protecting. For a standard self-propelled sprayer at a typical boom height, your buffer should reach at minimum 5 feet, and ideally 7 to 8 feet at full canopy. Second measurement is density. A buffer that you can clearly see through is a buffer that drift moves through almost unrestricted. The target is a porosity of around 40 to 60%, which means a wall of plants thick enough to slow wind, but not so dense that it creates dangerous turbulence on the leeward side. This is why a single row of sorghum or a double staggered row of sunflower works so reliably, because those plants naturally settle into that ideal porosity range. Third measurement is width. The general rule is that buffer effectiveness extends about 10 times the buffer height downwind. A 6-foot tall buffer protects roughly 60 feet of field downwind, and a 10-foot tall buffer protects roughly 100 feet, with effectiveness tapering off after that distance. Stack these 3 measurements correctly, and you have a system that captures between 50 and 90% of drifting droplets, while also capturing dust, slowing wind erosion, and providing pollinator habitat at the same time. One system. Multiple problems solved. Almost zero recurring cost. Now I want to address the question I get every single time I talk about this, which is, but does it cost me yield because the buffer takes up productive ground? The honest answer is that yes, the buffer takes up 2 to 4% of your field area, and the better answer is that the protection it provides usually returns much more than that. You get yield protection from reduced drift onto your own crops, you get a pollinator boost in adjacent fields, you get wind protection that reduces moisture loss at the field edge, and you get reduction in dust losses. All of those benefits stack on top of each other, and across the published literature on field edge buffers, they typically more than offset the small loss of planted area. That is the math the input industry does not put on the front of their brochures. There's also the legal dimension, and this is where the buffer pays for itself in a way most farmers do not think about until the day it suddenly matters. In the United States, drift complaints are one of the fastest growing categories of agricultural litigation, with documented cases in nearly every state where row crops and specialty crops share property lines. The single strongest defense in a drift dispute is documented evidence of buffer planting on your property, with photographs, planting dates, and species records. Courts have repeatedly held that a farmer who installs a documented vegetative buffer has demonstrated reasonable care, and reasonable care is the legal standard that determines liability in most negligence claims. A neighbor who sues you for drift damage has to prove negligence, and a buffer is the cheapest negligence defense ever invented. So now you have 3 reasons to take this seriously: yield protection, net revenue increase, legal protection, all from a planting decision your grandfather already understood. Let me show you how to start, because the implementation in your first season is simpler than almost any other field practice you have ever attempted. Step 1. Walk your property line, identify the prevailing wind direction, and mark the boundary you share with sensitive crops, neighbors, water, schools, or roads. Step 2. Choose a single species from the 7 on the manual list based on your hardiness zone, your existing equipment, and the available planting window. For most farmers in the central United States, sorghum or sunflower in summer, switchgrass for permanent buffers, and standing corn for fall and winter coverage is the simplest sequence to start with. Step 3. Plant a single row at the boundary, at the spacings specified in the manual, with seed you already have or can obtain at minimal cost from a neighbor. Step 4. Document the planting date, the species, the spacing, and take a photograph at full canopy, because this documentation is your legal protection in case of a future complaint. Step 5. Observe and adjust each season, expanding the buffer where drift events occurred, and adapting species to what performs best on your specific soil and microclimate. The whole system can be implemented in a single afternoon on most operations, with seed you already store, on ground you were not productively using anyway. Now let me circle back to the core question: why has this knowledge been buried so completely that most farmers under the age of 50 have never been formally taught any of it? The honest answer is that defensive planting is the kind of agricultural knowledge that does not generate a sales call, does not show up on a quarterly earnings report, and does not appear in a sponsored field day. It is folk knowledge dressed in modern science, and the structures that fund modern agricultural extension have steadily moved away from anything that does not have a transactional component attached to it. This is not a story about cartoon villains. It is a story about an industry where the practices that make money for someone keep getting repeated, and the practices that simply work but make money for nobody quietly disappear from the conversation. A buffer of grain sorghum at the edge of your field has no marketing budget, no sales rep, no distributor margin, no royalty agreement, and that is the only reason most growers under 40 have never heard of it before. But you have heard of it now, and once a farmer truly understands how a buffer works, the knowledge does not go back into the vault. It spreads from one fence line to the next. Quick final reminder: the Defensive Planting Field Manual with the 7 species, the spacing, the design templates, and the legal documentation guidance is linked in the description and pinned in the first comment. One access point. The complete knowledge, permanent. This is the documentation I wish someone had handed me 10 years ago, before I lost a crop, before I lost a relationship with a neighbor, before I learned all of this the hard way. Now, you do not have to make those same mistakes, because the entire framework is sitting in that link, ready to download. If this video changed how you think about the edge of your fields, do me a favor right now, hit subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment with the species you're going to plant first this season. I read every single comment, I respond to as many as I can, and I am building the next video around the questions you leave on this one. This channel exists for one reason: to put the buried knowledge back in the hands of the people who actually grow food. That is a job we do together, one farmer, one fence line, one buffer at a time. I will see you in the next vault.